Okay, so the last two presentations, there's not a lot of slides, there's not a lot of prescribed content. I'm going to walk through some, I'm going to talk a little bit about the challenges with the various guidance and regulation systems that we've walked through over the past day and a half. I'm going to talk a little bit about what some of the challenges might be for Mongolia for adapting them or implementing them. And then I'm going to walk through some recommendations for what we would do if we were in your position. But I will, again, disclaim those recommendations because we don't, the piece that we're missing right now is precisely what MRPAN and Mongolia are trying to accomplish in the long run. Because there are, depending on what the end goal is for the classification and disclosure guidelines, you could end up with very different recommendations for best way to move forward. Start out with the challenges, some of the stuff we deal with day to day, and some of the stuff that might be more specific to Mongolia, and then we'll get into the recommendations. So moving back to COGI, the guidance is very comprehensive. The breadth, as you saw on that last slide, you can see that COGI was one of the leading guidance documents in the world for how much it covers. One of the problems inside COGI is when you get into the guidance, there's always verbiage, there's always outs, there's always terminology that is not black and white. It always leaves room for exceptions, special cases, and basically, as long as you explain how and why you have done something differently, it doesn't explicitly prevent you from doing that. And it has to be that way. There's a reason for it. There's a good justification for that. You can't be too specific and too prescribed, or you start to narrow the applicability of the guidance for various applications. So because it's such a broad document and it covers so many different types of assets, so many different types of oil and gas projects, it has to have some flexibility. But that flexibility, we spend a lot of time as independent consultants trying to handle that flexibility because every consultant, every evaluator, every client has different interpretations of the same data. And the flexibility that's inherent in COGI causes differences in opinions. So one of the problems with all of the guidance systems, and this isn't specific to COGI, is that there's always gray areas, and it causes a lot of discussion. It causes a lot of differences of opinions on how things should be done. That said, we're still talking relative to not having standards or some of the other international standards in the world. It's very good at standardizing how evaluations are done. This is really talking more about less material issues. The big material issues are very cut and dry. You might be talking about whether you book a certain location in a certain area or how you deal with fixed and variable operating costs. They're really, the scope of the evaluation is covered very well, but some of the smaller items that are less material can be painful to come to a consensus on how they should be exactly calculated or applied. Another issue is, and we run into this in Canada recently, is the pace of technology. This has caused issues with updates. These documents, because they affect so many people, so many companies, so many jurisdictions, they're quite difficult to update. They take a long time to update, and with the rapid pace of technology that's coming out from the oil and gas industry, it can cause lag between the guidance and what's happening in the industry, and that's what we saw in the unconventional boom in Canada in the late 2000s and the early 2010s. So COGI has reacted, they have adjusted their guidance, but it was probably a year or two behind when it was first needed. So it does take to update the guidance for changes. And the issue with Canadian oil and gas is that first word, it's Canadian. It's very specific to Canada. There are a lot of companies and countries that are aware of COGI, but the only ones who are actively compliant and issuing NI 51-101 and COE reports are Canadian publicly disclosed companies and Canadian private companies, as well as any international companies that hold assets in Canada. PRMS, there's comprehensive reserves and resource classifications in PRMS, but the actual implementation and evaluation guidance, how you should do calculations, how you should, whether you should be using deterministic or probabilistic, volumetrics, material balance, that's relatively sparse in the original PRMS document. It is, as it says, it's addressed to an extent by the application of the supplementary document that goes into a lot more detail. But again, in comparison to COGI, PRMS is not as in detail. The same as with COGI, basic technology advances and updates. I would say that PRMS is even more challenging to update on a regular basis because it's used in so many more jurisdictions. You have to be very careful when you're adjusting such internationally recognized. And finally, the guidance in PRMS is limited to reserves and resource definitions and evaluations. So this is the intent of PRMS. It's definitely intentional. There's nothing wrong with it. Again, this is in comparison to COGI. COGI talks about disclosure. It talks about best practices for companies. It talks about best practices for evaluators. And it really has a wider scope than the PRMS document. PRMS is very specific to evaluating oil and gas assets. Getting into the disclosure, this is where we start getting into more what might not be as applicable for Mongolia specifically. The intent of NI 51-101 is disclosure for public companies in Canada. It's really tailored to that intent, and there's quite a bit of specific information and prescriptive guidelines that are directly relevant to Canada and Canadian practices. If Mongolia was going to adopt, we'd either have to adapt or remove. We've talked about a few of the issues, things like the professional organizations. There are certain references to Canadian accounting and legal standards that might not be applicable. There's the other issue with, because this is public disclosure, I would say there is a higher degree of scrutiny and disclosure requirements than there would be for a lot of government reporting systems. So COGI is very specific and very detailed as to how and what companies need to provide, and some of it might be overkill for what MRPAM or Mongolia would need to see in disclosure to government. So again, it's not a bad thing. It would be easy to remove some of it, but there's a lot of very specific disclosure requirements that are likely not necessary. They're likely overkill for Mongolia's purposes. There's a lot of disclaimer statements that are required. They're very specific about what you have to say about certain types of volumes, certain risks, certain uncertainties that you have to. NI 51-101 states you have to disclaim these things, and that's really to protect the investors and to protect the public. And if you're disclosing to a government organization, the people who are reviewing those volumes should be technical people. They're not like the average investor. So they're likely not, all those disclaimers are likely not necessary for government disclosure purposes. There's some specific stuff about, and again, it's Canadian process, filing on CDAR, on our public repository. There's discussions about annual information forms. So there's a lot of small things that are tailored towards public disclosure in Canada that are not necessarily applicable. That said, the overall guidance, the overall reserves, resource guidelines for what should be disclosed and what needs to be disclosed, and the reference to COGI would all be directly applicable if you chose to go with the Canadian system. One of the other issues with NI 51-101, we talked a little bit about it, it can contradict COGI guidance in some instances. It's usually not material instances, but it's very clear in NI that it says anything that is contrary or in conflict between the two documents is superseded by NI. So there are a few issues with consistency between NI and COGI. And finally, as we're talking about all the specific and detailed guidelines, companies are starting to find that some of the requirements are very onerous. So just recently in the last year, when NI 51-101 in 2014, they came out with the guidance around reserves other than resources, or resources other than reserves, sorry. When they came out with that guidance and started to really, when they told companies all the things that they needed to disclose, initially companies were okay with it. They continued to disclose their contingent resource volumes. But then the ASC started, the regulators started putting out guidance that said companies weren't being specific enough, companies were being too generic in some of the guidance that they were putting out in the public around their contingent resource volumes. So they're really pressuring public companies to be more and more transparent and more detailed. And it's getting to the point now where certain companies in Canada are saying this is way too much, it's not worth it, and they're starting to debate not even disclosing their contingent resources just because it's so onerous for the reporting requirements. So it's another one of those things where it has to be fit for purpose. And if it's the Mongolian government trying to get reserves disclosure from third-party companies operating in Mongolia, you're not going to need that level of detail. You're going to want a high certainty in the estimates and the evaluation procedures, but you're not going to need that much on the disclosure side. So SEC, one of the biggest issues with SEC is the intent. The intent to provide comparable disclosure is really not applicable to what the Mongolian government is probably going to be looking for. You're going to be more worried about what's the best estimate of the assets, what's a reasonable approximation of the value of the assets. You're not so much concerned about stacking company A up against company B and making sure, or seeing how their volumes fall out. So again, it goes back to conditions being designed for consistency, not necessarily accurate representation of assets. It has the same issue as NI 51-101. It's probably worse in terms of very specific and prescriptive guidelines. We talked about S-X, which is really financial accounting standards. So they're very specific to U.S. accounting standards in FASB and GAAP. Proved versus unproven. So again, the emphasis is on proved reserves. They at least now allow possible and probable, but it's really geared towards 1P only. Focus on accounting and NPV disclosures. That's what I was just talking about. There's a lot more revenue disclosure that, again, for a government organization trying to get a handle on the reserves within the country is probably not relevant. It does not permit reporting of contingent and or prospective resource volumes, which is another big problem. And it contradicts PRMS and COGI guidance in some instances. So that's really getting at, if you wanted to adopt PRMS or COGI as the guidance, you wouldn't want to adopt SEC disclosure guidelines because they're not really in agreement with some of the PRMS and COGI guidelines as we talked about. On the guidance side, this is the easier part. They're both excellent standards. They have different benefits and disadvantages. COGI, as we talked about, very comprehensive. It covers a wide scale or a wide scope of guidance. Reserves other than resources is really the gold standard right now on contingent prospective resource evaluation and disclosure for classifying those volumes. It's a very comprehensive document. PRMS is trying to catch up to resources other than reserves guidance now. It covers pretty much everything on the evaluation side, and it does cover some disclosure guidance. It covers all reserves and resource volumes. PRMS, the major advantage is the international recognition. Globally, all of the major oil and gas players are familiar with PRMS. It covers evaluation standards, and it covers all reserves and resource volumes. So both standards are applicable to all jurisdictions, as well as conventional and unconventional resource types. So in terms of whether the standards in COGI and PRMS would be applicable to Mongolian assets, they absolutely would. COGI, although it's currently more specific to Canada, they're in the progress of updating it, and they're generalizing a lot of the content, so it's less Canadian tailored. If we were going to make a recommendation for what we anticipate MRPAM and Mongolia is going to need moving forward, we would recommend adopting PRMS simply because of the international recognition. If in the long term you're trying to attract foreign investment and you're going to have countries like Russia, China, Canada, the US, major companies that operate in a number of different jurisdictions, you're going to want a standard that when they come into your country and start to develop assets, you want to go to them and say, you have to disclose your reserves information to us in accordance with a standard that they're very familiar with. So COGI right now, as I said, the only jurisdiction where it's readily recognized is Canada. PRMS is going to give you that international leverage. The caveat to that is that it would be easier to implement COGI. You would have a good starting point on your regulatory framework. You could take NI 51-101. The adaptation of NI would not be as difficult as coming up with your own regulatory framework for PRMS. So it's a little bit more work. There are other jurisdictions that do directly reference PRMS in their disclosure guidelines, but most of them are behind on the level of detail of disclosure. So Australia, as an example, they're struggling right now with their country's reserves because their disclosure guidelines have not been up to the level of Canada and the US. Regulation and disclosure, so this is where it gets a little more complicated. No matter what you choose, it's going to have to be adapted to your purposes. It's going to have to be adapted to Mongolia, to government reporting, to whatever the intentions of your organization are. NI 51-101, again, we've talked a bit about some of the challenges in terms of the intent of NI is not the same intent that you have for government disclosure. It's also somewhat specific to certain Canadian standards and practices. So, like I said, you would have to adapt. The SEC, we would definitely recommend you stay away from the SEC regulation and disclosure. The comparative intent, again, doesn't help you. It's not going to help you to go to companies and say, we only want to see your 1P reserves on constant price forecast. You're probably, it's not going to be in alignment with your long-term goals for oil and gas development in Mongolia. It's not going to allow the reporting of contingent prospective resources when you're a relatively immature oil and gas jurisdiction. You're going to have a lot of resources initially that are not well defined. So you want to have a handle on those resources early so you can understand the best way to develop those assets moving forward. And it's got a lot of very detailed U.S. standards and practices in terms of financial accounting that, again, would not be relevant to a government application. So if we were to recommend what to do on the regulation and disclosure side, there's likely a number of sources where you can get a starting point, or you can take a look at a number of different countries that have government reporting disclosures to see what they do, as opposed to the public disclosure guidelines that we've been talking about for the last couple of days. But what it really comes down to is understanding what you're going to want to see companies provide in their reserves and resource information. So some of the questions you're going to want to ask yourselves internally, 1P, 2P, or 3P, or all of them. if we were starting a system from scratch, we would probably recommend all three, because especially for government reporting purposes, knowing all three levels of uncertainty is going to give you the best handle on what the actual answer could be in the range that it could fall within. Same thing, low, best, and high resources. That's another reason that 1P, 2P, and 3P reserves are a good way to go. Right now, it's a little bit odd in Canada under NI 51-101, because most companies disclose 1P and 2P reserves, but then they disclose low, best, and high resources. And so when you're comparing volumes and you're looking at how we would look at them on the McKelvey box, moving bottom to top, you have corresponding volumes for the low and best estimated resources, but the possible reserves aren't there to correlate to the higher resources. Reserves or reserves and values. So do you just want to worry about the volumes, or do you want to see volumes and MPVs? Resources or resources and values. So again, do you want some indication of whether the resource volumes are likely to be economic or sub-economic? Reconciliation. This is one of those ones that is probably a very good thing to have in your disclosure. It's an easy way to have a report card for the volumes that are being disclosed to you. Gross or net reserves, or both. Forecast price, constant price, or both. That one's more of an interesting question for government disclosure. I think there's valid reasoning to use both of them. So internally, you'll have to decide what you're trying to accomplish with volumes. And then this is a list of examples of things. We've gone through a lot of this stuff, so everything in the slides we've gone through for NI, SEC, as well as some of the stuff in CODI and PRMS, all of those components of evaluations and disclosure, you really need to high grade what's important for Mongolia and for the agency, what you want and what you want to see. So there's a lot of different questions to answer, and again, that's probably why you want to start with some sort of document like NI 51-101, or perhaps what the Chinese or the Russians have for disclosure requirements, because it'll at least give you a very good starting point as to, okay, what do other people look at? What do other governments look at? What kind of information are they requesting? And it'll give you a good foundation to build around.